This is ABC Fora.
But what I'm going to talk about, just to wrap up the panel tonight, is about this tension between Wallace's non-fiction work and his fiction work. George Orwell wrote, right towards the end of his life, that the journalism that he had to write to pay his bills was actually draining him of all of the inspiration that he needed to write his fiction. And he had this fantastic sentence. He said that he felt smothered under journalism. I have become more and more like a sucked orange. And it's interesting because I think David Foster Wallace, like Orwell, was one of those rare writers who could do both stunning fiction and really quite incredible journalism. He was ambidextrous enough really to switch between these two genres throughout the course of his life. But where Orwell felt that journalism was sucking him dry, I think DFW describes a really different effect, at least in certain parts of his career. For him, he saw journalism as filling up the tank of inspiration and basically allowing him to turn off that hypercritical gaze that he used to really sharpen and hone his fiction, and instead to sort of look outside of himself and to pay extraordinary attention to the sorts of tiny details that many journalists would simply overlook. Journalism almost turned Wallace into an eye on a stalk, a kind of human camera that would go out and just record that micro level of detail that we simply weren't used to getting in broadsheets or in magazines. While he could still be personal, I'd suggest, in his non-fiction work, it didn't seem to require the same kind of excoriating self-analysis that he would dredge up in order to write his fiction. And let's face it, I'd suggest that in his journalism he was also pants-wettingly funny. And I will find that I laugh more hysterically reading his journalism than I do almost anything else that he ever wrote. I'll never forget the first time that I read a supposedly fun thing that I'll never do again, back in 1997. And in particular, an essay that he wrote about his experience on a cruise ship, which was called Shipping Out, on the nearly lethal comforts of a luxury cruise. I'm sure some people here are familiar with it. I literally had tears running down my face as he was describing this journey of a semi-agoraphobe who hates the water, being sent by Harper's Magazine to go and cover the experience of being on a cruise ship for 2 weeks and being pampered almost to death. Of course, he's on board the good ship Zenith, which he immediately renames as the good ship Nadir, and he manages to nail every single detail, from the metaphorical vapidity of the advertising brochure down to the precise polymer that he used to actually grade his porthole window, and right down to the functioning of his toilet and shower in his cabin. And that's actually the section that I'd just like to read to you briefly today because I think it's just too brilliant. Cabin 1009's bathroom deserves extravagant praise. I've seen more than my share of bathrooms, but this one is a bitchingly nice bathroom. Merely enter and hit the overhead lights, and on comes an automatic exhaust fan whose force and aerodynamism gives steam or offensive odours just no quarter at all. The fan's suction is such that if you stand right underneath its louvered vent, it'll make your hair stand straight up on your head, which together with the abundantly rippling action of the Sirocco hairdryer makes for hours of fun in the lavishly lit mirror. The shower overachieves in a very big way. The hot setting is exfoliatingly hot, but it only takes one preset manipulation of the shower knob to get perfect 98.6 degree water. The shower head's force pins you helplessly to the stall's opposite wall, just as the head's massage setting makes your eyes roll up and your sphincter just about give. But all of this is just small potatoes compared to 1009's fascinating but potentially malevolent toilet. The toilet's flush produces a brief but traumatising sound, a kind of high B gargle, as if of some kind of gastric disturbance on a cosmic scale. Along with this sound comes a suction so awesomely powerful that it's both scary and strangely comforting. Your waist seems less removed than hurled from you, and with a velocity that lets you feel as though the waist is going to end up someplace so far away that it will have become an abstraction, a kind of existential sewage treatment system. I mean, it's brilliant. And I think it's this capacity to draw out just unbelievable detail and, of course, considerable reserves of humour, but also at the ground level, this sadness that has come up from Julian, from Carolyn, from Nick, this sadness is always present in his work, and it's as if he has to look outside in order to have this temporary escape from that kind of omnipresent sadness. It's hard for me to choose which pieces of DFW's journalistic stuff to read to you, basically because I'm so enamoured of all of them. And I can strongly recommend, if you haven't read A Supposedly Fun Thing and Consider the Lobster, that you immediately rush out and procure both of those books. But I think the reason why I find these essays so brilliant is not because of their manifest content, because to be honest, some of the sorts of topics that he chooses are kinds of things that would normally bore me into a coma. For example, his essay on the excesses of the Illinois State Fair, or the badnesses of Terminator 2 as special effects porn, or his multiple essays on tennis. Not usually a subject which throws forth great writing, but Wallace's essays on tennis, a sport in which he once ranked in the top 100 in the USA, I'd suggest are absolutely a thing to behold. His piece on Federer as a religious experience is totally valve-blowing in its capacity to make a magazine article about tennis as gripping as a big-screen thriller, and I'd suggest far more poetic. He sums up his stunning Federer article thusly. In the same emphatic, empirical, dominating way that Lendl drove home his own lesson, Roger Federer is showing that the speed and strength of today's pro game is merely its skeleton, not its flesh. He has, figuratively and literally, re-embodied men's tennis, and for the first time in years, the game's future has become unpredictable. You should have seen on the ground's outside courts the variegated ballet that was this year's Junior Wimbledon. Drop volleys, mixed spins, off-speed serves, gambits planned 3 shots ahead. Whether anything like a nascent Federer was here among these juniors can't be known, of course. Genius is not replicable. Inspiration, though, is contagious and multiform, and even just to see close up power and aggression made vulnerable to beauty is to feel inspired and, in a fleeting, mortal way, reconciled. So we have aesthetics, moral philosophy, drama and pedagogy, all in this one 8,000-word article. And yes, Wallace could write to length, and we certainly saw that in Infinite Jest, and we can see it in his journalism. Seriously long, detailed features were his journalistic forte, and he ripped them out with much greater regularity than he did his fiction. He was, quite simply, very good at it, and managed a really particular tone of voice, this way of writing that became distinctively his own, but I'd suggest inspired a whole lot of writers and journalists to experiment with their own style. I mean, in his own words, this idea that genius is not replicatable, but it can generate these multiform inspirations. I think that's the best description of his influence on the literary and journalistic world. And certainly beyond stylistics, journalists and editors have admitted that it's changed the way they see. For example, this is Betsy Guzor, who wrote in the McSweeney tribute page to David Foster Wallace. She writes that he inspired her and many colleagues to look at everything a little closer and with a little more empathy and a little less irony. What's more, Wallace actually enjoyed writing non-fiction. He actually found it pleasurable. And he contrasts this with a way in which he found writing fiction actively painful. He found it gut-wrenchingly hard. But for all of that, he found it to be the most worthy thing he could be doing. In a letter to Don DeLillo, he wrote, "I do not know why the comparative ease and pleasure of writing non-fiction always confirms my intuition that fiction is what I'm supposed to do, but it does. And so now here I am flogging away in all senses of the word, and feeding my own wastebasket." But this ease that he describes, I think, is vividly left for us to see on every non-fiction page that he wrote. It flows inexorably, drawing us into areas of concern and specialisation that would otherwise just seem kind of weirdly arcane. He was not afraid of poetically kind of boring detail and saw a sort of power in it. And in fact, this, of course, was going to be the topic of the final book that he was working on before his death, The Pale King, where he looks at the lives of tax agents and how they manage this sort of transcendent bliss after you've been bored senseless by checking thousands and thousands of tax returns. He was fascinated by that kind of excellence and feeling of oneness that comes from extreme boredom. But his journalism for me gives me this sense of what can happen when you're not afraid of paying attention to exquisite tiny detail. They open up and flower and become ultimately fascinating. And I think it's a really dark art that he could do this, because it's not something that we commonly see in contemporary journalism. But I'd suggest that since his entrance into non-fiction, many others have learned from him and possibly made journalism a whole lot better on account of it.
This is ABC Fora.